My name is Kirill. I'm working at Mews, and as you already know, we are building a large and complex property management system for hotels, and we have a set of smaller products. One of which is a mobile application that is mainly intended for housekeepers and for other hotel staff. And initially, it was written as a native application for both iOS and Android. And about 1.5 years ago, we decided to rewrite it from scratch in Flutter. So in this talk, I would like to share some problems we've encountered so far. So the architecture we've eventually came to. And in the end, I will answer the question whether it actually was a good idea to rewrite the application from scratch and to use Flutter for that. So first of all, let me quickly describe the functionality of the application. This is just a common B2B enterprise app with all the set of functionality you would normally expect from it. So it's authentication, forms validation, some messaging and tasks management system, and so on. There are though a couple of moments that are not so common. So first of all, we have a fully custom UI, or it's even better to say the custom design system that stands on the same level of hierarchy as material design or Cupertino design. And it's used across all our products. So it has implementations in mobile apps and web applications. And another moment, which may be not so common for the majority of apps, but it's pretty standard in enterprise world. The backend is serving a set of products. It's not app-centric. So it solves a lot of different tasks, and the models on the backend and the processes on the backend, they don't really match the models we define in the app. So it has some impact on the architecture. And speaking of the architecture, mainly we are following clean architecture principles. And if I would have been asked to describe the clean architecture principles in a couple of words, for me, it probably would be mainly layers and direct, like strict direction of dependencies between these layers. So for us, one of the major layers is API, where we define DTOs and methods for communication with backend. And all the other functionality is divided into a horizontal set of features, where each feature can be viewed as a separate standalone module with some rather complete functionality, and it communicates with other features as little as possible. So for us, one feature can be, for example, task management, another can be messaging system, another can be like profile management. And inside of each feature, we have already a vertical layer of some vertical hierarchy of some common layers, with a business logic layer on top, where we define our app models and where we define the interfaces for fetching and posting data, only interfaces. Next comes the data layer, where actually these interfaces are implemented, and this is the layer that communicates with API. And so, yeah, as I said here, our backend is pretty common. So if you have an app-centric backend, if the mobile app is the main product of your company, you probably have very close match of backend models and app models. In this case, maybe the data layer can be excessive, and your business logic layer can directly communicate with your API layer and reuse these DTOs as models. With code generation support, it could be very easy to set up this in this way, and you will remove a lot of duplication in your code. But as I said, for our case, we decided that it's better to introduce this intermediate proxy layer that communicates with API and acts also as a mapper layer from backend, sorry, from backend DTOs to application models. And at the bottom, there is a presentation layer, which is the only layer that knows about Flutter, and it knows also about business logic and data logic, and acts also as a dependency injector layer, as a glue layer that combines everything together. Regarding the implementation, as a main pattern, we are using BLoC pattern, and I won't be talking in very much details about it. There are a lot of resources out there about BLoC, but in a couple of words, in BLoC, we have two main entities. This is UI component and BLoC, which stands for business logic component. And BLoC component, BLoC can be viewed as an entity that receives a stream of events that can be emitted either by UI or by another block. And it transforms these events and maps them into a stream of states, which again can be consumed either by UI to render and display the interface or by some another block. It's very similar to Redux pattern in terms that, for example, we have this unidirectional data flow, but it has also some differences. For example, we don't have a single store, a single state for the whole application. Instead, the application is considered as a set of different stub states with different blocks communicating with each other. And what I especially like about the BLoC pattern is that looking at this limited set of states where the app can be and the events that force the transition from one state to another, it's basically a state machine pattern. And from my experience, pretty much all of the business apps, at least the application that I was developing, they are very nicely represented by this state machine pattern. So for us, as I already said, we are using this BLoC pattern. We are using Flutter BLoC library, and we are mainly follow these common practices, these guidelines from this library, how to structure the app. But we have a couple of differences. First, regarding block-to-block communication, here you see it as dashed arrows. So as they say on the official library guidelines, if you have block A using some state or emitting events to block B, you're just passing block B as a dependency to block A, and using these methods directly in block A. For me, it's not very clean solution because block A knows too much about other blocks. Instead, I prefer to define it in the way that block A have just dependencies on some abstract stream of states of block B, for example, or it just receive a sync for putting their events there. In this way, for example, in our test code, we can just define the dependency as a stub sync that does nothing if we are not interested in the events, or we can pass there some predefined stream of states, and in that case, block is really decoupled. It doesn't know anything about any other blocks in the system. And another difference, it's not related to the Flutter BLoC library itself, but to the BLoC pattern as a common. I often see that developers are treating these blocks as view models and define the block state very close to the UI level. So, for example, even things like confirmation dialogues or button text are defined as a part of the block state. For me, it doesn't make that much sense, and I prefer having the UI state and UI logic in the UI layer, and instead, BLoC is responsible for a higher level, for application logic or for business logic. And the best way to divide whether some state or some logic belongs to UI or to BLoC can be this thought experiment. Just imagine that at some point in time, we decide to switch from Flutter UI or even from graphical user interface to command line interface. In this case, the only changes that we do should really be done only in UI layer. Ideally, BLoC layer won't be changed at all. And a couple of words about principles that we follow while developing the architecture. Here, I need to say that in Mews as a common and in our mobile team, specifically, we like functional programming. And while we are not very deep into hardcore functional programming, and one of the reasons for that Dart is actually not the best language for that, we try to extract some like really practical outcomes, some practical advices from the functional programming principles and apply it so they can be really together with objective-oriented approach as a whole. So first of all, it's immutability, which means for us that all our models, all our states and events are immutable. Next, pure functions, which again, that means that at least our business logic functions are free from side effects as much as possible. And it's heavily use of algebraic data types. For example, for us, that means that we use coproduct types, or how they're called, like sealed classes, as a which is basically a sealed hierarchy of classes where your class can have a limited number of child classes. We are using it for states, so the BLoC can be into, or for events that can be emitted to blocks. And another use case here is the way we treat errors. So for example, in our business logic code, we don't throw errors at all. Instead, we are using the helper wrapper type either, which basically represent that the result you expect from the function can be either error or success. And in this case, client using this function is forced to deal with this result if it wants to get some meaningful successful result. It has to deal with the situation that actually there can be some error there. And another principle, which I really hope that it's kind of more a temporary hack than a like ground principle, is because due to the fact that we are not having this proper non-nullable types yet. Hopefully, it will be resolved soon. We will have a proper support for non-nullability by default. But for now, we have to deal with it. And it's really a common source of bugs and errors. And we just decided that in our business logic code, we treat all the types as immutables. And when we really want to pass some absent value there, we are using this wrapper optional type. Let's now talk about libraries which we find useful. And of course, these are not all the libraries that we are using in the app, but instead we treat them as a like starter kit or as a must-have libraries that I believe can be useful for any app development. First of all, it's Freeze library. It's based on a code generation, and it removes a lot of boilerplate when you're defining immutable classes or when you're using this co-product or seal classes that I was talking about. So for example, this is how a typical BLoC event looks in our application. We just state that tasks BLoC can receive one of these predefined event types. And later, inside the BLoC, we are mapping these events using the generated map methods. We process each of the events with some predefined function. And the nice thing about that is that if at some point in time we are introducing another event there or changing some event, we are actually forced to update this code as well. We are forced to introduce another branch here, otherwise we will get a compilation error. The only disadvantage of this freeze library for me is that currently it doesn't play well with immutable collections. So for that, we are using another library, build collection. It's not based on code generation. Instead, it introduces some helper types such as build map or build list, and a number of help methods for updating the items in the collection using the builder pattern. As I already mentioned, for BLoC pattern implementation, we are using Flutter BLoC library. And so this is how typically our BLoC structure looks like. So first of all, it's state, which is implemented with this freeze library. It can use either like sealed class implementation or just can be an immutable class that holds all the data. We define the event again with the freeze library for defining the set of events that can be emitted there. And the typical implementation of BLoC looks like this. We have a processor where we define which function will process the emitted event, and the typical event processing can look like that. For example, when the task created event was emitted, first we are yielding the loading state, then we are using create task method that actually is an interface method, and the implementation is defined in data module. And it returns this either type that I was talking about. And based on the result, we are either emitting some error state or doing some side effect of maybe updating the task or maybe saving it to database and triggering a success state. Another library that is heavily used mainly in API layer is JSON serializable, which is again based on the code generation, and it just removes a ton of boilerplate for defining your DTOs and making them serializable and deserializable. And together with that comes retrofit library. And if you're coming from native Android background, you probably heard about this library. So the idea is that you're defining the interface methods for communicating with API backend, and the library generates the body of these methods and dealing with serialization and deserialization of requests and responses. So it's the same library, but implemented for Dart. And of course, the provider library, which we are mainly using for dependency injection made in a Flutter way. Now let's speak about teamwork, because basically if you have more than one developer, you already have a team, and you have to define some best practices and find some compromises on how to structure your code, how to deal with many things there. And first of all, it comes about formatting. This is the thing I really like about Dart, that by default it comes with the Dart FMT tool, and so there is only one way to properly format your code. And actually the official formatting rules are defined as whatever Dart FMT produces as output. That eliminates all the arguing about how to structure your code, or maybe except for whether we should add trailing comma here or not. But yeah, it's minor thing. And you can also actually set up your CI machine in the way that it will just fail the build if the code is not formatted properly. The only thing I don't like about this Dart FMT is that it uses this 80 characters limit. And this is actually the moment where I can confidently say that I'm thinking in the same way as Linus Torvalds, or at least we both agree on the point that 80 characters hard-coded limit is a bad idea. Luckily, Dart FMT allows you to override this. And while you cannot set up the lint rule, in terms that you can either turn on the lint rule and it will force you to use your 80 characters limit, or you can turn it off at all. But at least you can override the Dart FMT input parameter and pass it. So in our case, we are passing 120 characters limit there. And after formatting, there comes static analyzer. And again, this is the thing I like about Dart. It has a very powerful and customizable static analyzer. And my only concern about it is that by default, it's too forgiving. So my common recommendation here is to make it actually as strict as possible. You can go through all the rules provided by this analyzer and override your levels you want them to see. So it can be either error or warning, or you want to ignore this rule at all. And actually, we have a lot of rules defined as warnings, because when you're just in a development phase, when you're just playing with your code, you probably don't want the compilation to fail or your hot reload to stop working just because you have some not properly formatted code or you have some unused variables there. But when you're running it on the CI machine, you can set it up in the way that either errors or warnings, they fail the build, and in the master branch, you will have only the proper codes, like according to all the rules that you define. And if you don't want to go through all the rules and define your own levels, you can use one of the community packages. It can be pedantic package from Google, or effective Dart package with official effective Dart style recommendations, or you can use our Mews pedantic package. And now let's talk about CI/CD in more details. And so this is the point where I should actually say, don't follow our way, because we are using Azure pipelines for CI and CD, and because we are using it across the company, and so it's really powerful. You can set up a lot of things here, but it's not specific for Flutter or for mobile development. And that means that if you are using Microsoft hosted agents, they don't come with pre-installed Flutter. So with each build, you need to install Flutter, and all your steps you define there will be pretty low level. So for example, for release candidates, we need to install certificates, install Flutter, run through tests and analyzer, and build the release version and publish it somewhere. And this all is on pretty low level. There are some nicer alternatives out there, and first of all, it's GitHub Actions, and yeah, pretty much it's the same as Azure pipelines. So it's some common purpose tool where you will also have to like set up it on a very low level basis. And there is a major pitfall out there. If you're using macOS agents, and you will be using macOS machines at least for building your iOS version of the app, the time spent by this machine running is actually multiplied by 10. So, for example, if you have 2,000 free minutes a month, if you're using macOS machines, you actually have only 200 minutes. All the other platforms you see here, they are more or less Flutter-centric or mobile-centric. They all have some more or less usable free plans. And for example, I'm not sure about AppCircle, but Bitrise and CodeMagic, they also provide seamless integration with AWS device farm, which means that you can easily run your UI automated tests on the whole fleet of the real devices from AWS. And of course, this is not for free, but it's a nice option to have this seamless integration. And I've used CodeMagic platform for one of my side projects, and I need to say that, yeah, it's really easy to set up. If you have some common Flutter CI workflow, it's very easy to set it up, to maintain it, and to use it. And now let's speak about pitfalls, or at least some moments that you need to pay attention to while developing your Flutter application. For me, one of the major things is error handling. By default, if you have an error, if you have an exception in your Dart code, your application won't crash, which for me, as mainly a native developer, was kind of weird moments at first. So it's pretty crucial to use a proper reporting tool to set up your error reporting when you're publishing your application. And we are using Sentry platform for that. Another limitation or another point to take account is that Flutter, of course, is a cross-platform framework with all the limitation coming from it. And also Flutter is relatively new framework. So one of the frustrations we've had when we started developing the app, for example, was that there was no built-in password managers integration. Later, this was resolved. It's no longer the issue, but yeah, from time to time there are such moments. Of course, as a cross-platform framework, it cannot be on the same path with native frameworks, and if you have some new functionality in the native framework, you will have to wait until it lands into Flutter. Another thing that that can be like minor and looks simple, such as text ellipsizing. Actually, in Flutter, it works in really weird way. It looks ugly. And fixing this issue actually requires some refactoring in rendering engine itself. So far, it's still not resolved. Another moment, an infamous billion-dollar mistake, which in Java was a null pointer exception. In Dart, we are having it as a no such method error. And again, I understand that soon probably we will have this gone, and with non-nullable types by default landed in Flutter probably in the start of next year, we won't have to deal with it on a such constant basis. But for now, it's really a source of many bugs there, and we have to deal with it somehow. Another point here, which I call magic, and unfortunately, it's not some kind of good magic here. From time to time, you will receive some weird build errors, and especially in iOS builds. And so you will just have to do some voodoo steps to resolve this, like rebooting your machine, restarting your IDE, or doing Flutter clean, or repeating these steps in some different order. And sometimes it helps and your builds are gone, your errors in the build are gone, but sometimes not. And in this moment, you are actually lucky if in your team there is a developer with native Android or iOS background, because, for example, in Xcode errors, Xcode can produce some non-readable, non-understandable errors, and it's really hard to understand what's going on there. And the last moment I would like to mention here, it's what I call tightening screws. It's kind of more a philosophical point there. And what I'm talking about here, for example, we are having this bottom navigation bar item widget, and it used to accept title property where we could pass just a widget there, where we can customize it the way we want. And with some of the updates, we suddenly see that this title property is deprecated, and now we are supposed to use label property. But this label property accepts a plain string. So it can be a minor thing. I can be overreacting to this, but really I don't want the repeating of a story with the way the Android platform as a whole is going. When at the start we have a full freedom, we are having a huge possibilities to like develop our app, to do the things that we want, and as the time goes by, we are suddenly having less and less options, and even the options that were working previously are not allowed anymore. For me, it's kind of opposite way of where the like how the iOS platform is evolving. In iOS platform, mainly at the beginning, you have very limited set of possibilities, but when the time goes by, these possibilities are broadening, and you can do whatever you're used to do, but you have some additional possibilities there. Again, this is a philosophical moment, and it's just my concerns about how the Flutter platform is developing. So, as I promised in the beginning, regarding the question whether the Flutter was a good choice, whether it's actually made sense, whether I was right 1.5 years ago when I've convinced all the stakeholders to try to use a new technology and like decided on all the risks that can bring. Despite all the limitation I was talking about and some concerns and maybe even some unclear future regarding the Flutter that can arise there, I still believe that it was a good choice. The Flutter perfectly suits us. One of the major reasons is that, as I mentioned, this custom UI layer, custom UI library and design system, because we need to implement it only once and it works the same across Android and iOS, this really boosts up the development. And thinking about having to implement it independently for iOS and Android, this is pretty much scary thought, because for me, actually developing the UI in Flutter and tweaking it for both platforms is actually easier and faster than just developing it for one native platform. Like for me, UI view layer in Android is a total mess, and it's very hard to develop some custom UI there. Also, in terms of team, we are currently having a team of 4 developers, including me. We all are major coming from native Android backgrounds, and so the transition to Flutter was very smooth. And even in 90% of cases, it just works on both platforms in the same way. So the speed of development increased very much. The nice thing about it that the releases of the app are actually publishing practically at the same time. And so also, like Dart, honestly speaking, is not my favorite language, but I have to admit that with these libraries and with good code generation support, even the business logic can be developed in a very robust and straightforward and maintainable way. And so having it to implement only once, and especially having UI implemented only once, this really makes me happy, because otherwise I think we would require at least 1.5 times larger team with all the drawbacks that come in from this. So that's all from me. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me here, or feel free to find me on social networks by following the link you see. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kirill. I actually personally have a couple of questions. Is it hard to find Flutter developers on the market? Or are you looking for any developers?
Yeah, I would say that this is one of their major pain points currently. There are very few like Flutter developers and even less good Flutter developers, because basically I would say the currently senior Flutter developers are the guys who are developing Flutter. So yeah, we have to deal with it. And as I mentioned, all our team basically consists of native Android developers, and we just transitioned to Flutter development. And the nice thing is that the transition is very smooth. And yeah, if you're familiar with React Native framework, the transition can be very easy as well, because they share the same approach to UI layer and so on. And so actually, like maybe at some point it's really an advantage that we have not pure Flutter developers yet, because as I mentioned, there inevitably are situations where you need the native background, where you need the native experience. So for now, I think it's really easier to transition native developers to Flutter than looking for already existing Flutter developer.
Okay, thank you. And based on your experience with Flutter, do you think it's suitable for all kinds of companies or only smaller ones?
I would say it's definitely not only for smaller ones. Yeah, it's not a silver bullet. It won't fit for all types of application. Like, I don't see much sense in developing the game application in Flutter, or application that is highly one platform specific and is using very low level platform stuff. But like seeing at, for example, the requests for apps to be developed, like 80% of the apps are just some business apps with communication with backend, some like more or less custom UI. And with the current tendency of actually unifying the user experience in both Android and iOS, the Flutter is really a good choice in this segment. It really shines, and it allows you to develop the application in a very rapid pace. And so, yeah, I don't see any disadvantages or in using it for large companies for some complex applications.
Okay, thank you. Also, there are some questions on the YouTube, from the YouTube. First one, did you try to use some other method than BLoC?
Like maybe in some side projects, yeah, I was experimenting with different approaches. Like I was trying to just use the provider, not only for dependency management, but also for state management. So for simple apps, it works okay. For something more complex, I would still go to some like either BLoC or Redux, which I said is like very similar to it, or like other patterns, like more classic patterns like MVP or MVVM. I don't think that they are like that naturally designed for Flutter, because as I mentioned, like for me, this is the advantage that BLoC is not a view model. I don't like the view model to be very close to UI layer. Basically, this is kind of for me breaking the single responsibility principle. And so, for example, in Android or in iOS, where we have MVC, like in Android, we have this MVVM as a main pattern. We are kind of more forced to use this because the view layer there is kind of it's harder, for example, to do the automated UI tests in native Android. So because in Flutter we have this like tools to just run your widget in your test code and do this UI testing. It's very easy, and so in this way, I don't see a big profit in like dividing the view as a dump view, just doing the rendering stuff, and view model where you actually have the data of this view. So for me, really, like one of the best approaches there is either BLoC or Redux.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Can I start with Flutter without knowledge from Android or iOS?
I would say yes, but again, you will have some problems at some point in time where you will probably will have to ask for some consultation for someone with native Android background. You can definitely start with it. You can definitely in many cases you won't be in need of this experience, but still like knowing some things like application lifecycle in Android and iOS, and basically the patterns that are used for developing application. I mean, in terms of user experience, in terms of how things work, what are the limitations? Like, for example, background work in Android works in one way, in iOS it works in another way. So for more or less complex application, I would still recommend having maybe just some basic course on native Android development. It can be done like within like 1 month, attending some course, even some free course out there. And after that, you will really like understand what you are doing on Flutter. Because at this stage, like cross-platform frameworks such as React Native, such as Flutter, they are all based on the like existing native platform experience.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, am I right that you use blocks on business logic level only? Because you mentioned that you don't use it as view models, so it seems like it's not about presentation layer.
Yeah, it's mainly about business logic layer. So for UI related stuff, and normally like if this logic is UI related, it's pure UI logic, then it's in the majority of cases it affects only one widget. It shouldn't be propagated deep down the widget tree. So for that, just the built-in stateful widgets are nice for some simple logic, some simple updates, and for actually the app level data and for business logic data, we are connecting to the blocks.
Okay, thanks. Next question is, in Android we use MVVM, MVP, and etc. What are the equivalents of these for Flutter? What do you recommend?
Well, yeah, basically you can use the same one-to-one mapping. You can have model the same as in Android, same as in Flutter. For Vue, this is widget, and basically you can say that, okay, we are using only stateless widgets, and this will be our view layer. And we can use the view model. As I mentioned, some of them are using like blocks as a view model. Some of them have some like custom view model implementation and pass all the parameters there. I don't see much sense in it, but yeah, it's like for some developers, it's a right way to go, and why not? It's like as far as I know, there are no some like popular framework that suggests using this MVVM approach and provides you some like base classes, but I think it's pretty easy to use some custom implementation for that.
The next question is, how much time did it take to make at least MVP of your application in Flutter?
Uh, Regarding MVP, it was not strictly speaking MVP, because as I mentioned, we already had the native iOS and Android apps, but basically migrating to Flutter began in April, and so we've had our first like production ready version in September. So yeah, several months for moving to another platform. I think it's pretty okay. Like I don't say that this is a very huge application, right? It's like mainly the complexes about the application is more about some business logic that we need to process there. In terms of screens and UI, it's rather standard and simple, but still like back then I was doing it myself. I was the only Flutter developer there, so like several months for migrating the application from like some playing with Flutter to production ready. I think this is a good result.
Yeah, and doing it all by yourself is not bad at all. Okay, the next question is, how did you convince stakeholders and higher management that Flutter is the right tool for the job?
One of the points basically was that, yeah, back then we were just in the beginning of developing our design system. And so one of my major points was that, okay, we are either like finding a full-time Android and iOS developer who will be doing this UI library for us, or we are just like trying and implementing it in Flutter and see how it looks like and how it behaves like. Also, before that, so we were doing some like company-wide side projects for some like conferences and stuff like that. And like I was free to choose the technology for this side project, so I've used Flutter. I've presented it that this is actually already a viable technology. It's already has this like production release, and so it was working smooth. It was working okay. Basically the stakeholders saw that it was implemented very quickly. And again, we already had this native iOS and Android applications. So it was like, okay, if everything goes bad, then at least we already have this application working. The worst thing that can happen that, yeah, we will waste a couple of months on trying some technology. But if it works, then we have a major profit there. And in this case, like our stakeholders are like kind of pro something new and some new technologies. So yeah, for me, it was kind of easy to convince them.
Well, that's nice that it was so easy for you. Okay, the next question is, what about C++ and Qt developers? Are they suited to learn Flutter?
Well, pretty much everybody is suited to learn Flutter. It's I don't have an experience with like Qt or like C++ on in some long term, but maybe if you are happy with Qt, maybe it doesn't make that much sense. But one of the advantages of Flutter compared to other cross-platform framework is that it's developed by Google, and like they have been developing Android, and sorry Googlers if you hear that, but it was not the best experience with Android developing. And as I see that Flutter is done with having all these mistakes in mind and doing some like refactoring of the approaches of how the mobile development should look like. And so yeah, this is one of the major advantages of learning the Flutter. In terms of performance, it's like in 90% of the cases, it's very good. So, and so again, I'm not a big fan of Dart language, but it's still easier to transition from Java, from Kotlin, from JavaScript to Dart than transition to C++, for example. And again, in terms of maintainability, in terms of hiring new developers, finding a Dart developer is much more easier than find a senior C++ developer who is also interested in mobile development, because I think for C++ developers, there are pretty much other more complex opportunities to win.